The Pearl by John Steinbeck. Retold by M.J. Payne. Chapter 1. Kino, Juana, and Coyotito. Kino woke up early in the morning. The stars were still shining in the sky. The cockerels were beginning to crow, and the pigs were looking for something to eat. Outside the little wooden house, some birds were singing and moving in the bushes. Kino opened his eyes and looked at the light coming in the door. Then he looked at the box where his son, Coyotito, was sleeping. The box hung on ropes from the roof. Lastly, Kino turned his head towards Juana, his wife. Juana lay beside him on the mat. Her shawl covered her body and half her face. Juana's eyes were open. Her eyes were always open when Kino woke up. Juana had eyes like little stars. She was looking at Kino as he woke up. Kino could hear the sound of the waves on the beach. The sound of the waves was like music in the early morning. Kino's blanket covered his nose because the air was cold. He turned his head and saw Juana. She was quietly getting up. She went to the hanging box where Coyotito slept. She bent over and comforted Coyotito. The baby looked up for a moment, then closed his eyes and slept again. Juana went to the little fire. She took a piece of coal and blew it until it started to burn. Then Juana put pieces of wood on the fire. Kino got up and pulled his blanket around his head and shoulders. He pushed his feet into his sandals and went outside. He stood and watched the sun come up. Kino sat down outside the door and pulled the blanket round his knees. He looked at the little red clouds high over the sea. A goat came near and looked at Kino. Behind Kino, the fire began to burn brightly. Kino could see the flames and the light through the door. He could see the flames through the holes in the walls of his little house, too. Juana was busy making corn cakes for breakfast. Suddenly, the sun came up out of the sea. The sun was so bright that Kino covered his eyes. He could see Juana making the corn cakes. Kino could smell the corn cakes cooking, too. A thin, frightened dog came up and lay down next to Kino. The morning was beautiful, like every other morning. Kino heard Juana take Coyotito out of his hanging box. Juana washed the baby and pulled her shawl round him. She held Coyotito close and fed him. Kino could hear these things without looking at them. Juana was singing an old song. She sang the song in many different ways. The song comforted Kino. The song comforted Coyotito, too. There was a wooden fence around Kino's house. On the other side of the fence, there were some more houses. Smoke came from these houses, and Kino could hear people having breakfast. But these sounds were not like the sounds in Kino's house. His neighbors' wives were not like Juana either. The morning air was not so cold now, and Kino pulled the blanket from his face. Kino was young and strong. His black hair hung down over his brown forehead. He had hard, bright eyes and a thin, strong mustache. Yellow sunlight fell on the house. Near the wooden fence, two cockerels started to fight. Kino watched the cockerels for a moment. Then Kino watched some birds flying towards the hills. The world was awake now. Kino got up and went into his little wooden house. Juana was sitting near the fire. She got up as Kino came through the door. Juana put Coyotito back into his hanging box. Then she combed her black hair and tied it back with thin green ribbon. Kino sat by the fire and ate a hot corn cake. He only had corn cakes and milk for breakfast. When Kino had finished eating, Juana came back to the fire. She ate her breakfast, too. Kino and Juana were both happy. There was no need to talk. The sun was warming the little house. The light shone through the holes in the walls. The light shone on Coyotito. Coyotito was in his hanging box. Something moved on one of the ropes. Kino and Juana stood quite still and looked. A scorpion was coming slowly down the rope, and its tail was straight out behind. A scorpion's tail has a sting in the end, a sting that kills. The tail can bend over the scorpion's head when it wants to sting somebody. Kino was breathing loudly through his nose, so he opened his mouth to stop the noise. The scorpion moved slowly down the rope towards the box. Juana prayed silently. Kino moved very quietly across the room with his hands in front of him. His eyes were on the scorpion. Under the scorpion, in the hanging box, Coyotito laughed and put up his hand. The scorpion saw the hand and stopped. The scorpion's tail bent over its head. Kino could see the sting in the end of its tail. Kino stood very still and moved his hand forward very slowly. The scorpion's tail bent over again. At that moment, Coyotito touched the rope, and the scorpion fell. Kino put his hand forward very quickly, but the scorpion fell past Kino's fingers onto the baby's shoulder. The scorpion stung Coyotito. Kino cried out like an animal. He took the scorpion and pressed it between his hands. Kino threw the scorpion down and beat it into the ground. Coyotito screamed with pain in his box. Juana took the baby in her arms. She found the red wound. She put her lips over the wound and sucked. Juana sucked hard and spat out the poison. She sucked again, and Coyotito screamed. Kino stood and watched. He could do nothing. The neighbors heard the baby's screams, and they came out of their houses. Kino's brother, Juan Tomas, stood in the door with his fat wife, Apollonia, and their 4 children. All the neighbors tried to look into the room. One small boy was trying to see between the neighbors' legs. The people in front spoke to the people behind. "A scorpion," they said. "A scorpion has stung the baby." Juana stopped sucking the wound for a moment. The wound was red and getting bigger. All of these people knew about scorpions. A man can be very ill from the poison, but a baby can easily die. First, the wound gets bigger. Then the baby is hot and has a pain in the stomach. A baby can easily die if enough poison goes into the wound. The pain of the sting was going away. Coyotito stopped screaming and began to cry quietly. Juana was a little woman, but she was very strong. She always did what Kino wanted, and she was always happy. She could work hard and go without food, almost better than Kino could. When Juana was ill, she didn't need a doctor. But now, Juana did a very surprising thing. "The doctor," she said. "Go and bring the doctor." Chapter 2. The Doctor. "The doctor will not come," the people in the doorway said. "No," Kino said to Juana. "The doctor will not come to us." Juana looked at Kino. Juana's eyes were cold. Coyotito was Juana's first baby. He was the most important thing in Juana's life. "Then we will go to the doctor," Juana said. Juana put one end of her shawl over her head. She put the other end of the shawl over the baby's eyes. The people in the doorway pushed against the people behind, and Juana went out of the house. Kino and Juana went out of the gate to the little path, and the neighbors followed. They were all going to the doctor with Kino and Juana. They all walked quickly to the center of the town. Juana and Kino were first. All the neighbors and their children were following. The sun made black shadows on the ground. All the people and the black shadows moved quickly towards the town. They came to a place where the little wooden houses ended and the stone houses began. The city had houses with big walls and cool gardens. Red and white flowers hung over the walls. Juana and Kino could hear little birds in cages singing in the gardens. The poor people crossed the square and passed in front of the church. More people were following Kino and Juana now. Everyone was talking about Coyotito and the scorpion. The people knew that Kino and Juana were taking their baby to the doctor. The beggars in front of the church looked at Kino and Juana. The beggars looked at Juana's old blue skirt and the holes in her shawl. They looked at Kino's old blanket. They could see that Kino was poor. The beggars followed because they wanted to see what was going to happen. The beggars knew everything in the town. They knew about the little crimes and the big crimes. The beggars slept outside the church. No one could enter without the beggars knowing. And the beggars knew the doctor, too. They knew that the doctor was no good. They knew that he loved money more than anything else. They also knew that the doctor could not make people better. They had seen the dead bodies go into the church. There was nobody in the church now. There was nobody in the church with money, so the beggars followed Kino and Juana. They wanted to see what the fat, lazy doctor was going to do for a poor baby with a scorpion sting. The crowd of people came to the big gate in the wall of the doctor's house. They could smell the food cooking in the doctor's house. Kino stopped and thought about the doctor. The doctor was not of the same race as Kino. The doctor's race had beaten and robbed Kino's race for nearly 400 years. Kino always felt afraid and angry when he came near people of the doctor's race. Kino felt that he could kill the doctor more easily than he could talk to him. People of the doctor's race spoke to all of Kino's race as if they were animals. Kino raised his right hand to knock at the door. He felt angry. His lips were tight against his teeth, but he took off his hat with his left hand. Kino knocked at the gate and waited. Coyotito cried a little in Juana's arms. She spoke quietly to the baby. The crowd pushed nearer to see and hear. After a moment, the big gate opened a few inches. The man who opened the door was a man of Kino's race. Kino spoke to him in their Indian language. "My little boy," Kino said, "a scorpion has stung my little boy." The door started to close. The servant refused to speak in the Indian language. "Wait a moment," the servant said in Spanish, and shut the door. The bright sun threw the people's shadows on the white wall. The doctor sat on the bed in his room. He was wearing a dressing gown made of red silk. The dressing gown came from Paris. He was drinking hot chocolate from an expensive cup. The doctor held the cup gently between his fingers. The doctor was fat, and he did not look happy. There was a little bell and some cigarettes on a table beside the doctor. The furniture and curtains in the room were heavy and dark. The pictures in the room were religious, and there was a large colored photograph of the doctor's wife. She was dead. The doctor drank a second cup of chocolate and ate a biscuit. The servant from the gate came to the open door and waited. "Yes?" the doctor asked. "A little Indian with a baby is here," the servant replied. "A scorpion has stung his baby." The doctor put his cup down slowly. Then he got angry. "Have I nothing better to do than make little Indians well?" he shouted. "I am not an animal doctor." Then the doctor thought for a moment and spoke again. "Indians never have any money," said the doctor. "Go and see if the Indian has any money." "Yes, sir," said the servant. The servant opened the gate a little and looked at the waiting people. This time, the servant spoke in the Indian language. "Have you any money?" he asked. Kino put his hand under his blanket. He brought out a piece of paper. He slowly opened the paper so that the servant could see 8 pearls. The pearls were ugly and gray and almost without value. The servant took the pearls and closed the gate again. This time he soon came back. He opened the gate and gave the pearls to Kino. "The doctor has gone out," he said. "He was called to a man who is very sick." Then the servant shut the gate quickly because he felt ashamed. Now all the people felt ashamed because they could not help Kino. They slowly went away. The beggars went back to the church steps. Kino's friends went home. They tried to forget Kino and Juana and the shame that they felt. Kino and Juana stood in front of the gate for a long time. Kino slowly put his hat on his head. Then, suddenly, Kino hit the gate with his hand. He looked down, surprised at the blood running between his fingers. Chapter 3. Kino Finds a Pearl. The little wooden houses of the fishing people were built near the beach on the right of the town. There were canoes in front of the houses. Kino and Juana came slowly down the beach to Kino's canoe. Kino's canoe was the most valuable thing he owned. The canoe was very old. It had belonged to Kino's father and grandfather in the old days. Now it belonged to Kino. A canoe was valuable because a man could get food with it. If a man had a canoe, he could always give a woman something to eat. If a man had a canoe, he did not need to fear hunger. Every year, Kino covered his canoe with plaster which his father had taught him to make. The plaster hardened on the outside of the canoe and made it strong and safe. Now Kino came to the canoe. He laid his diving stone, his basket, and ropes in the bottom of the canoe. Then he folded his blanket and laid it in the boat. Juana laid Coyotito on the blanket. She put her shawl over him so that the hot sun could not shine on him. Coyotito was quiet now, but the wound made by the scorpion's sting was getting worse. Juana could see that the poison had gone up to his neck and under his ear. Coyotito's face was red and hot. Juana collected some brown seaweed and put it on the baby's shoulder. Seaweed was as good a medicine as the doctor could have given to Coyotito. But because this medicine was simple and didn't cost anything, people didn't think it was much good. The dangerous stomach pains had not come to Coyotito. Perhaps Juana had sucked out the poison in time, but she still worried about her firstborn child. Juana had not prayed directly to God for Coyotito to get better. Instead, she had prayed that Kino might find a pearl. Then they would have money to pay the doctor. Kino and Juana pushed the canoe down the beach into the water. Juana climbed in, and Kino pushed the back of the boat. Kino walked in the water beside the canoe until it floated on the little waves. Then Kino and Juana paddled the canoe forward. It moved quickly through the water. The other pearl fishermen had gone out to sea before Kino and Juana. In a few moments, Kino could see the fishermen in their boats above the oyster beds. The oyster beds were very valuable because any oyster might have a pearl in it. Pearls are made by accident. A small piece of sand hurts the flesh of the oyster. The oyster then covers the piece of sand with smooth plaster. This plaster becomes hard like rock and turns into a pearl. If the oyster covers it again and again, the pearl becomes bigger and more valuable. In the past, these oyster beds had made the King of Spain very rich. And because he was rich, he had become very powerful. The pearls from these oyster beds had helped the King of Spain to pay for his wars. Men have dived for oysters for centuries. They collect the oysters from the bottom of the sea and open them to look for pearls. Kino had 2 ropes. One was tied to a heavy stone, and the other was tied to a basket. Kino took off his shirt and trousers and put his hat in the bottom of the canoe. The water was as smooth as oil. Kino took his stone in one hand and his basket in the other. He put his feet over the side of the canoe, and the stone pulled him down to the bottom of the sea. Bubbles came up behind Kino until the water cleared and he could see clearly. He looked up. The surface of the water was like a bright mirror, and he could see the bottom of the canoe. Kino moved carefully so that he did not fill the water with mud and sand. He put his foot on his stone. He worked quickly as he pulled the oysters away from the bottom of the sea. Kino's people sang songs about everything that had ever existed or happened. They sang songs about the fishes, about the angry sea, and about the calm sea. They sang songs about the light and the darkness, and about the sun and the moon. Everyone knew these songs. As Kino filled his basket, he could hear the songs of the sea in his head. Kino was holding his breath, and he could also hear his heart beating. Little fish swam by, and Kino thought of another song. This song was the song of the pearl that might be, because every shell he threw into his basket might contain a pearl. It was not easy to find a pearl, but Kino might find one with luck and the help of God. Kino knew that Juana was praying in the canoe above him. Juana was praying very hard for Kino to be lucky. She wanted a large pearl because it would buy medicine for Coyotito. Kino was young and strong. He was very proud that he could stay under the water for more than 2 minutes and collect the largest shells. The oyster shells were shut tight because Kino was moving them. A little to Kino's right, there was a rocky little hill covered with young oysters that were not yet ready to be collected. Then, just near a little rock, Kino saw a very large oyster lying by itself. The shell was partly open. Inside, Kino saw something shining. And then the shell shut quickly. Kino felt excited. He pulled the oyster loose and held it tightly. He kicked his foot free from the stone. His body rose to the surface, and his black hair shone in the sunlight. Kino put his arm over the side of the canoe and laid the oyster in the bottom. Juana held the boat still as Kino climbed in. Kino's eyes were shining with excitement as he slowly pulled up his stone. Then he pulled up his basket of oysters and lifted it in. Juana could see that Kino was excited. She pretended not to look at the large oyster. Juana always thought that if she wanted something too much, the luck might go away. Juana stopped breathing as Kino slowly opened his short, strong knife. He looked thoughtfully at the basket. Perhaps he should open the big oyster last. Kino took a small oyster from the basket, cut the flesh, and searched inside. Then he threw the oyster back into the sea. Then Kino looked at the big oyster. He sat in the bottom of the canoe, picked up the shell, and looked at it for a long time. The oyster was shining black and brown. Now Kino felt that he did not want to open the oyster. The shine that he had seen inside might only be a little piece of shell. Under the water, a man could see many things that were not real. Juana's eyes were looking at Kino, and she could not wait. She put her hand on top of Coyotito's covered head. "Open it," she said softly. Kino quickly pushed his knife into the shell. The shell tried to close, but Kino pushed hard, and the shell fell open. The flesh of the oyster moved, then was still. Kino lifted the flesh, and there lay a great pearl. The sunlight fell on the pearl and made it shine like silver. It was the largest pearl in the world. Juana held her breath and made a little noise. The song of the pearl was loud in Kino's head. This shiny pearl would make all of Kino's dreams come true. Kino picked the pearl out of the oyster and held it in his open hand. He turned the pearl over and saw that it was very beautiful. Juana looked at the pearl in Kino's hand. That hand had hit the doctor's gate. The broken flesh had turned gray and white in the sea water. Without thinking, Juana went to Coyotito, who was lying on his father's blanket. Juana lifted the seaweed and looked at Coyotito's shoulder. "Kino!" she cried suddenly. Kino looked up and saw that the poison was going out of the baby's shoulder. He saw that the poison was going out of Coyotito's body. Then Kino's hand closed over the pearl, and he put back his head and cried out loudly. His eyes rolled, and his body was stiff as he screamed towards the sky. The men in the other canoes looked up, surprised. Then they paddled quickly towards Kino's canoe. Chapter 4. Kino's Dream. People do not know how news travels through a town, but it travels very fast. News travels faster than small boys can run. It travels faster than women can talk about their neighbors. Kino and Juana and the other fishermen came to Kino's little wooden house. The town was already full of the news that Kino had found the biggest pearl in the world. Mothers had heard the news before their little boys could tell them. The news reached the little wooden houses and spread among the stone houses where the rich people lived. When the priest heard the news, he thought of the repairs that his church needed. The priest thought about the value of the pearl. He tried to remember if Kino had ever brought Coyotito to the church. The priest tried to remember if he had married Kino and Juana. The news came to the shopkeepers, and they looked at the things that they had not sold. The news reached the doctor, too. He was sitting with a very old woman. The woman's only sickness was old age, but the doctor would not tell her because he wanted her money. When the doctor heard about Kino's pearl, he thought for a long time. "I am looking after his son," the doctor said. "I am giving the child medicine for a scorpion bite." The news about the pearl came to the beggars in front of the church. The beggars laughed with pleasure. They knew that a poor man who suddenly becomes rich always gives money to beggars. The men who bought the pearls from fishermen were called buyers. These buyers sat in their little offices in the town. When a fisherman brought in some pearls, the buyers argued and shouted until the fisherman took a very low price. When the buyers had bought some pearls, they sat alone. Their fingers touched the pearls and played with them. But the buyers did not really own the pearls. There was only one rich buyer, and he paid the other buyers to work for him. The news about Kino's pearl came to these men. Their eyes became thoughtful, and they dreamt of owning this large pearl. Each man thought that the rich buyer would not live forever. When the rich buyer died, someone had to take his place. Each man thought that if he had enough money, he could become a rich buyer, too. Many people were interested in Kino now. Something strange happened to each person when they heard about Kino's pearl. The pearl became a part of everyone's dreams. It became part of their hopes and part of their plans for the future. The pearl became part of everyone's wishes and needs. Only one man stopped these people from having the pearl. That man was Kino. And so Kino became everyone's enemy. The news of the pearl brought something black and bad to the town. This black and bad thing was like a scorpion. The town seemed to have become full of poison. Kino and Juana did not know these things, because they were both so happy and excited. Kino and Juana thought that everyone was happy and excited. In the afternoon, when the sun had gone over the mountain into the sea, Kino sat in his little wooden house. Juana sat beside him. The house was full of neighbors. Kino held the great pearl in his hand, and the pearl felt warm and alive. The neighbors looked at the pearl in Kino's hand. They asked themselves how such luck could come to any man. Kino's brother, Juan Tomas, sat beside Kino. "What will you do now that you have become a rich man?" he asked Kino. Kino looked at his pearl. Juana looked down and covered her face with her shawl so that the neighbors could not see her. Kino looked into the shining pearl and dreamt of all the things that he had always wanted to do. In the pearl, Kino saw Juana, Coyotito, and himself in the church. Kino and Juana were being married because now they could pay the priest. "We will be married in the church," said Kino softly. In the pearl, Kino saw how they were dressed. He dreamt of their wedding. Juana was wearing a new shawl and a new skirt. Under the long skirt, Kino could see that Juana was wearing shoes. Kino himself was dressed in new white clothes, and he carried a new hat. Coyotito also wore shoes. He wore a blue sailor suit from the United States and a little cap. Kino saw all of these things in the shining pearl. we will have new clothes," he said. Then Kino dreamt of more things that he could buy with the pearl. Now that he was rich, he could buy a rifle. Kino saw himself in the pearl, holding a rifle. Everything that Kino saw was a dream, but it was a very pleasant dream. A rifle. "Perhaps," said Kino softly, "I will buy a rifle." The neighbors, who were listening in silence to Kino, nodded their heads. A man sitting at the back said softly, "A rifle? Kino will have a rifle." Juana looked at Kino. Her eyes opened wide at the things Kino had said. A new strength seemed to have come to him. Kino looked again into the pearl and had another dream. He saw Coyotito sitting at a little desk in a school. Kino had once seen a desk through an open door. Coyotito was dressed in a jacket, and he had a white collar and a wide silk tie. And Coyotito was writing on a big piece of paper. Kino looked at his neighbors. "My son will go to school," he said, and the neighbors were silent. Juana looked up in surprise. Her eyes were bright as she looked at Kino. Then she looked down quickly at Coyotito in her arms. Could all this be true? She thought. "My son will open books and read," Kino continued. "My son will learn to write and know about writing. Coyotito will learn numbers, too. These things will make us all free, because if Coyotito knows, then we will all know." Kino looked into the pearl again. He saw himself and Juana sitting by the fire in the little wooden house, while Coyotito was reading from a big book. "The pearl will do all these things," Kino said. Kino had never spoken so many words in his life, and suddenly he was afraid of his talking. Kino's hand covered the pearl because he was so afraid. The neighbors knew that they had seen something great. They knew that they would talk about Kino and the pearl for many years. If Kino's dreams came true, the neighbors would be able to say how Kino's eyes had shone. The neighbors would say that some great power had entered Kino and that he had become a great man. If Kino's dreams did not come true, the neighbors would say something different. They would say that a foolish madness had entered Kino and that he had spoken many foolish words. Kino looked down at his closed hand. The skin was white where he had hit the doctor's gate. The evening was coming, and it was getting dark. Juana carried the baby in her shawl. She went and put some small pieces of wood on the fire. The fire burnt up, and the flames shone on the neighbors' faces. The neighbors knew that it was time to go home, but they did not want to leave. They stayed in the house until it was almost dark, and Juana's fire was making big shadows on the walls. Then they suddenly started to whisper to one another, "The father is coming! The priest is here!" The men took off their hats and stepped back from the door. The women covered their faces with their shawls and looked down. Kino and his brother Juan Tomas stood up. The priest came in. He was an old man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He thought that the people were like children, and he spoke to them like children. "Kino," he said softly, "you are named after a great man who was a great father of the church." The priest made his words sound very important. "The man that you are named after taught the people many important things. Didn't you know that?" asked the priest. "It is written in books." Kino looked quickly down at Coyotito's head. Kino thought that one day his son would know the things that were written in books. Kino did not feel so happy now. He looked at his neighbors to see what could have made him feel so different. The priest spoke again. "I hear that you have found a great pearl." Kino opened his hand and held it out. The priest breathed quickly as he saw the size and beauty of the pearl. "I hope that you remembered to give thanks to God who gave you this pearl," the priest said. "I hope that you will pray to God to help you in the future." Kino nodded his head without speaking, but Juana answered softly, "We will, Father, and we will be married now. Kino has said so." Juana looked at her neighbors, and they all nodded their heads. "It is nice to see that your first thoughts were good thoughts," the priest said. "God bless you, my children." The priest turned and left quietly, and the people moved back to let him pass. But Kino's hand closed tightly on the pearl, and he looked around. He was beginning to be afraid again. The neighbors went home, and Juana sat by the fire. She put the pot of boiled beans over the little flame. Kino walked to the door and looked out. He could smell the smoke from all his neighbors' fires. Kino could also see the stars in the sky. He began to feel cold, so he covered his nose with his blanket. The thin dog came to him and shook itself. Kino looked down, but he did not really see the dog. He felt alone in the world, and he did not feel safe. The night insects seemed to be singing about something bad. Kino shook a little and pulled his blanket more tightly against his nose. He still held the pearl, and it felt warm and smooth in his hand. Kino could hear Juana behind him. She was making cakes near the little fire. For a few moments, Kino felt safe. Then he felt afraid again. Kino was afraid of making plans. He knew that it was dangerous to make plans. Bad things happen to a man who makes too many plans. Kino wanted the money that the pearl would bring him. He wanted to send Coyotito to school. He had so many plans. But it was dangerous to make plans, and Kino was afraid of the danger. But he wanted the money. Kino stood at the door and looked out into the night. Chapter 5. The Doctor Comes. While Kino was standing at the door, he saw two men coming. One of the men was carrying a light which shone on the ground and on the man's legs. The men came through the opening of Kino's wooden fence and then came to the door. Kino saw that one of the men was the doctor and the other was the doctor's servant. "I wasn't at home when you came this morning," the doctor said. "When I heard about your baby, I came as quickly as I could." Kino stood in the door, with hate burning in his eyes. He was afraid again. He was afraid because the doctor's race had beaten and robbed Kino's race for hundreds of years. "The baby is nearly well," Kino said quickly. The doctor smiled, but his eyes did not smile. "Sometimes, my friend," the doctor said, "a baby that has been stung by a scorpion will begin to get better. Then, suddenly—" The doctor made a little noise with his lips to show how quickly death could come. "Sometimes," the doctor said again, "a sting will leave a thin leg, or a blind eye, or a bent back. Oh, I know about scorpion stings, my friend. I can make your baby better." Kino felt even more afraid. He did not know about scorpion stings. The doctor had read many books. Perhaps the doctor was right. Kino was angry at himself and at the doctor. He was angry at himself because he had not learnt to read books. He was angry at the doctor because the doctor knew this. Kino did not know what to do. He felt sure that the doctor was telling lies, but he could not do anything which might be bad for his son, Coyotito. He stood back and let the doctor and the servant enter the little house. Juana stood up from the fire as the doctor came in. Juana covered the baby's face with her shawl. When the doctor went to her and held out his hands, Juana held the baby close to herself. She looked at Kino. The shadows from the fire were moving on his face. Kino nodded, and Juana let the doctor take Coyotito. "Hold the light," the doctor said. The servant held the light high, and the doctor looked at the wound in the baby's shoulder. The doctor thought for a moment. Then he pulled back the baby's eyelid and looked at Coyotito's eyes. The doctor nodded his head as the baby moved about in his arms. "I thought this would happen," the doctor said. "The poison has gone in, and the baby will soon get worse. Come, look." The doctor looked into the baby's eye. Kino looked and saw that the eye was a little blue. Kino did not know whether the eye was always blue or not. He did not know whether to believe the doctor or not. But there was nothing Kino could do. The doctor took a little bottle of pills from his bag. Then he took Coyotito and pressed the baby's lips until Coyotito opened his mouth. The doctor's fat fingers put the pill far back on the baby's tongue, so that Coyotito could not spit the pill out. Then the doctor took a jug of water and gave Coyotito a drink. The doctor looked again at the baby's eyes and then gave Coyotito back to Juana. "I think that the poison will get worse in about an hour," the doctor said. "The medicine may save the baby. I will come back in an hour. Perhaps I am in time to save your son." The doctor took a deep breath and went out of the house. The servant followed with the light. Juana held Coyotito under her shawl. She looked at the baby, and she was worried and frightened. Kino came to her. He lifted the shawl and looked at his son. Kino moved his hand to look under the eyelid. Then he saw that the pearl was still in his hand. He went to a box by the wall, took a piece of cloth from the box, and put the pearl in it. Then Kino went to a corner of the little house and made a little hole in the floor with his fingers. He put the pearl